the British colonial administration was quite anxious to create a particularly exclusive Sikh identity. This becomes very clear from our perusal of the data, the information that Ram Swarup has collated in this pamphlet. And this exclusive Sikh identity, which the British tried to create, they hoped that it would be understood by everybody, including the members of the Sikh community, as distinct from the mainstream of Indic traditions. That is, the spiritual traditions, the cultural traditions, which are indigenous to India, traditions which have originated and flourished on the Indian soil. So that is one. And secondly, as consummate imperialists with clear and substantial colonial interests in India, the British remained highly suspicious of the Sikh community and its political directions. So much so that they could never really regard with any real respect the symbols and individuals from which the Sikh community derived its pride, as well as its social, moral, spiritual sustenance, regardless of all the machinations which the British had set in motion in the hope of fomenting a secessionist Sikh nationalism, a strategy which ultimately backfired on the British. This, I think, is especially important in the context of today's politics and today's socio-cultural dynamics. I'm very glad to connect with all of you once again, to be here on the platform of Sangam Talks. So, as you can see, the topic of today's discussion is a pamphlet written by Sri Ram Swarup, noted author, and even some would say a mystic. Ram Swarup ji had written this particular pamphlet back in 1985, and it's titled Hindu-Sikh Relationship. As it so happened, I discovered this particular work 2 years back while I was going through Sitaram Goel's works mainly. I happen to have translated some of his works. And this particular pamphlet, I felt, was not very well known to many people. And therefore, the primary goal of this talk today is to reintroduce this pamphlet, Hindu-Sikh Relationship, to those who had perhaps once read it, but in a major way to introduce it for the first time to many people who might not be aware of the existence of this work by Sri Ram Swarup ji. So let me begin by giving an overview of the contents that we can encounter during this talk. So I will start with a brief description of the contents in this work, what this work is all about. It actually starts off with an introduction, a very well-written introduction by Sitaram Goel ji. And it goes on to describe the phenomenon that Sikhism is in the larger dynamics of the Bhakti movement in the medieval times. And this sort of provides the historical and socio-political context of Sikh spirituality and not Sikh politics, so to speak. We will come to that part at a more appropriate juncture. And when we actually go into the writing of Ram Swarup after the introduction by Sitaram Goel, we get to see how a community gets politicized by British policy. Now, this is not a one-off phenomenon. It is not that the British had focused entirely on the Sikh community. It had done a similar kind of politicization with several other communities in India during the entire career of British colonialism in this subcontinent. But for the purpose of this talk, for the purpose of highlighting the importance of Sri Ram Swarup's Hindu-Sikh relationship, this particular pamphlet, it will be very, very important to see how both Sitaram Goel and Ram Swarup delineate, describe, and explain, interpret the impact of British policy, colonial British administration's policy on the Sikh community in particular and the Hindu society in general. And I will also try to describe how a three-pronged approach was taken by the British policymakers, administrators, where specific roles were played by scholars, the British Army, and the Christian missionaries who came along with the colonialists, or maybe even before the colonialists, and prepared the ground for colonialism in the subcontinent, as it happened in other parts of the world as well. So, looking at this three-pronged attack, uh, we will be able to understand Sri Ram Swarup's explanation, interpretation of the impact of British policy on the Sikh and Hindu communities. So, what is this work all about? If we take a close look at this, we see that it contextualizes the origin of Sikhism as well as the Khalsa within the historical evolution of ideas through movements and political movements, through spiritual movements as well as political. The premises and the arguments of this work by Ram Swarup are based on his observation of socio-political phenomena in pre as well as post-independence India. So he not just interprets history as he knows it, but also tries to uh, explain the political happenings around him at his own time. So he also gives a sort of commentary on the politics of his contemporary times. And most significantly, this pamphlet, Hindu Sikh Relationship, has been a great work of summarizing the entire history of spiritual movement, cultural movement, as well as political movements in Bharatvarsha from medieval times onwards, and especially from the time when Guru Nanak Dev Ji introduced a new strain of the Bhakti movement in the form of Sikh spirituality. We see when we start reading this pamphlet that it has a moderately elaborate introduction by Sitaram Goel. And this introduction really contains a preamble and a summary of the dynamics of Indian history from the 15th century onwards, including regional manifestations of the Bhakti movement. So Sitaram Goel actually describes how the Bhakti movement manifested in different parts of the country, and there in this sort of collage of different manifestations of the movement, he locates the specific role of the phenomenon of Sikh spirituality. The history of Sikh spirituality and Sikh politics through the Mughal era in particular, and also in the British colonial era in much more detail, are described in this pamphlet. And this pamphlet actually achieves the work of identifying that particular point in history when politics becomes dominant and its relationship with the spiritual movement of the Sikh community starts to wane. This is very, very important to understand Sikh history in general, trying to locate the particular spiritual movement and at what point of time this movement took a very defined political dimension, and what were the different stages of that political movement, starting with the formation of the Khalsa, and after the passing away of Guru Gobind Singh Ji, how the Khalsa reorganized itself and asserted through ultimately the great Sikh kingdom, or even you can call it an empire, the Sikh empire under the leadership of Maharaja Ranjit Singh. And from that point onwards, how the British took charge of the destiny of Sikh political movement and how it disintegrated into factions, and how the seeds of social disharmony and even a sort of dissonance in the spiritual realm were also introduced by the British. So all of that has been very well summarized by Ram Swarup in this pamphlet, Hindu-Sikh relationship. So this work also gives us an evaluation of the role of scholarship by the British and Sikh scholars in shaping the narratives of Sikhism, of Sikh history, of its politics, and ultimately of the Hindu-Sikh relationship. So Ram Swarup, through this particular work, has given us a very pertinent account, a very comprehensive account of the evaluation, uh, as per his own understanding, of the different aspects that I just mentioned. But the focus was on the dynamics shared by the Sikh community and the larger Hindu community. Finally, this work is also majorly about the role of the British colonial administration's policy. Now, let us go into the text proper. We'll discuss the introduction by Sitaram Goel at first, and then the observations by Ram Swarup. So, Sitaram Goel starts off with a sort of preamble, as I mentioned in the beginning, which reads as follows. I will read it out. Quote starts: Sikhs have always been honored members of Hindu society. Hindus at large have always cherished the legacy left by the Gurus and venerated Sikh Gurudwaras no less than the shrines of any other Hindu sect. There has never been any bar on intermarriage, interdining, and many other modes of intermingling between the parent Hindu society on the one hand and the Sikh community on the other. Hindus and Sikhs share a common cultural heritage and a common historical consciousness of persecutions suffered and freedom struggles fought. In an excellently articulate and comprehensive manner, Sitaram Goel provides us with this summary of the dynamics between the Sikh and the Hindu communities. Especially, I would like to draw your attention to this word, to these phrases towards the end. They share, the Hindus and Sikhs share a common cultural heritage and a common historical consciousness of, and that historical consciousness grows up from persecutions suffered together and freedom struggles fought together. So this is how the introduction begins. So this can be described as a preamble to the pamphlet Hindu-Sikh relationship by Ram Swarup. And this also effectively summarizes the arguments that will be elaborated by Ram Swarup later in this document. So the historical context that this introduction explains very well can be understood from this particular quotation, this section from the introduction by Sitaram Goel, where he remarks, Guru Nanak came from a Vaishnava family in that part of the Punjab which went to Pakistan after the partition in 1947. So he gives us an idea of how Sikhism evolved, and he talks about the very beginning of the community, its spirituality, and that's why he's talking from the times of Guru Nanak Dev Ji. So Sitaram Goel continues to say that he was born at a time when the sword of Islamic invaders had already swept over the length and breadth of India and done immeasurable damage, not only to the shrines and symbols of Hinduism, but also to the self-confidence of Hindus. This is extremely important to note. The damage was not just done to the shrines and symbols of Hinduism, but also to the self-confidence of the Hindus of Punjab. The Punjab, along with northwest frontier and Sindh, had suffered more heavily than elsewhere. Many Hindus in these provinces had been converted to Islam by force. The rest had been reduced to second-class citizens who could not practice their religion publicly without inviting persecution at the hands of Muslim theologians and tyrants. It was in this atmosphere that Guru Nanak asserted the superiority of his ancestral spirituality as against Islamic monotheism, which had divided mankind into hostile camps and set children of the same divinity at each other's throats. So, another important thing to note here is how Sitaram Goel, through this introduction to Ramswarup's Hindu-Sikh relationship, uh, identifies the main problem which had moved the Hindu community to give birth to a special articulation of its spirituality, and what were the historical conditions for that particular strain of spirituality to take birth. Firstly, he observes that the major symbols of Hinduism, including the shrines, the temples, and other places of worship, the vigrahas, the murtis, were raised to the ground. And therefore, it was not really possible to, while being under the Islamic rulers and under the sway of the Muslim theologians who were controlling these invaders turned administrators of Punjab, Sindh, Northwest Frontier Province, and many other places, to really express or reassert Hindu thought, Hindu spirituality with the help of vigrahas, temples, and those symbols. So, Hindu spiritual thought reasserted itself. It found a new way of articulation, of expression in the yogic and Advaitic methods, where the Nirakar Upasana, Nirakar Sadhana are emphasized. So, this is very important to note in the introduction that Sitaram Goelji offers. He continues to say, what Guru Nanak had proclaimed was, however, a part of the Hindu response to the Islamic onslaught. The response was two-pronged. While Hindu warriors fought against Islamic invaders, Rajputs, the Marathas, and eventually the Sikhs, they all gave a military response to the onslaught of the different dynasties of Muslim rulers, Mughals being the most significant of them all. The response was two-pronged. While Hindu warriors fought against Islamic invaders on many a battlefield all over the country, Hindu saints and sages created a countrywide spiritual upsurge, which came to be known as the Bhakti movement. The message of this movement, Sitaram Goelji tells us, was the same everywhere, based as it was on the Vedas, the Itihasa Purana, and the Dharma Shastras. The only variation on the central theme was that while most schools of bhakti deepened the spirit behind behind outer forms of worship, some others laid greater emphasis on Advaitic mysticism as expounded in the Upanishads and the various traditions of yoga. The latter schools alone could flourish in the Punjab and the rest of the Northwest, which had been denuded of Hindu temples and where ritual practices were forbidden by the Muslim rulers. It was natural then for Guru Nanak Dev to be drawn towards this school in the course of his spiritual seeking and sing its typical strains in his own local language. As I was explaining, why the resurgent Hindu spiritual thought expressed itself in a particular manner, where Nirakar Upasana, Nirakar Sadhana, Nirgun Brahma are much more dominant than the Sakara Upasana symbols, is this, that firstly, the entire Northwest, and particularly the Punjab, as Sitaram Goel points out, were denuded of Hindu temples. There were no Hindu temples. They were all razed to the ground. And therefore, there was also a lot of pressure on the Hindu communities there that they do not practice rituals and they do not go into ritual worship of their deities, of the Devis and the Devatas. So the only option left to the Hindu community, which found itself at the cusp of a new renaissance, a new birth with the Bhakti movement, with the oncoming of the Bhakti movement, was to express itself through this Nirakar mode of Upasana. And that gave birth to Sikh spirituality. That is how Sitaram Goel explains the historical context of the origin of Sikhism. Now I will go into Ram Swarup's, after the introduction, how Ram Swarup actually talks about the different forms of British colonial administration's policy in shaping the narrative of Sikhism, of Sikh spirituality, and how it impacted the dynamics of relationship between the Sikh community in particular and the Hindu community at large. In this, a very interesting document is called Developments in Sikh Politics, which came out sometime in the early 1920s. And this was actually a summary of the different political movements that were taking shape in Punjab and also by the Punjabi diaspora in countries like Canada and the US during 1900 and 1911. So this report was actually a confidential one, and it was, as you can see, prepared by someone called Mr. D. Petrie. He was later given knighthood in 1922 or 25. And he was actually, at the time when he was writing this report, an assistant director of criminal intelligence of the CID, headquartered in Delhi, of the government of India, the colonial government of the India, run by the British. So, in this particular report, it has been copiously quoted by Ram Swarup in his analysis of British policy, apart from the works by other colonial scholars. But this particular document is significant in the sense that it actually betrays the anxiety that the British colonial administration had towards the various communities, but Sikh community in particular, because it had tried many means through the British Army policy, as well as through the policy that it had taken for formulating personal laws and how to manage the wealth and land of the various gurdwaras and so on and so forth. And it sort of frustrated the British when it saw that its attempts, though they were bearing fruit in the long term, in the short to middle term, they were not as fruitful. At least they were not to the liking of the British. So this particular document, I would invite you to read this. It is easily available on the internet. At one time it was confidential, but now it is available in the public domain. So if you read it, you will be able to understand how actually the British looked at the Sikh community in particular, but also various other communities, and how it introduced and practiced the divide and rule policy that we so often speak about. So, if we go into Ram Swarup's analysis of the British policy on Sikhs based on such documents by Petrie and by scholars of the colonial era, we get to see that, like I said, it's three-pronged, but I have actually divided into four parts here. Firstly, the scholarship by British and other European scholars, British administrators, and loyalist scholars. By loyalist, what Ram Swarup means is that section of the Sikh scholars who were loyal to the British administration, the British colonial administration. And the second part is, of course, the army policy during the British era, and especially after the 1857 rebellion, or as we call it, the First War of Independence. The number of the Sikh recruits increased drastically after the 1857 rebellion, and there were also many new many new uh, strategies taken by the British to influence the opinions of the Sikh community, and to create them as a distinct nation. So we will get into that. But the third part here was the attempts to link Sikhism with Abrahamic religions by downplaying its organic relationship with Bharatiya traditions. This was mainly done by the scholars and some colonial administrators who were writing reports, such as Petrie himself. They often lamented the fact that some of these attempts to Abrahamize the Sikh spirituality was not bearing as much desirable fruit as they would have liked. And finally, Ramswarup also threw some light on the activities of the Christian missionaries through scholarship as well as proselytization through converting people into the Christian faith. Although Ramswarup's analysis does not go as deep into the missionary activities as it has gone into the scholarship aspect and the army policies. So we'll go into this scholarship aspect first. Ramswarup names the scholars who took part in the project of building a pro-British and anti-Bharatiya narrative through scholarship. And these are Max Arthur Macauliffe, the person who had partially translated the Guru Granth Sahib, and had also prolifically written on his understanding of Sikh history. Then Thomas Patrick Hughes, another British scholar, who had prepared the Dictionary of Islam. And very interestingly, he had devoted a lot of pages on Sikhism in this Dictionary of Islam. And Ramswarup goes into the details of this entry on Sikhism in this dictionary and analyzes why Hughes had taken so much pains to explain and situate Sikhism within Islam. Another scholar who Ramswarup mentions is Dr. E. Trump, who was actually a German Indologist, and he was also a Christian missionary. But although Trump was employed by the British to find out the fault lines specifically in Sikh spirituality and the Hindu spirituality, and or at large the Indic traditions, Dr. Trump was unsuccessful. He clearly stated that it was impossible to find such clear fault lines, fundamental fault lines, and that the differences are mainly external at the surface level. Apart from these chief individuals, we also get various reports prepared by officers of the British colonial administration, and some of these scholars were administrators as well as scholars. So, apart from Macauliffe, Hughes, people like Macauliffe, Hughes, and Trump, there were administrators, British administrators from the colonial era, who themselves took up the task of doing scholarship on Sikh spirituality and other strains of Indic spirituality. And then there were, of course, the so-called loyalist scholars and authors. By loyalist, as I explained, Ramswarup means those among the Sikh scholars who were loyal to the British administration. So Ramswarup observes that the seeds sown by the British began to bear fruit, seeds of division sown by the British. In 1898, Kahan Singh, the chief minister of Nabha and a Pakka loyalist, wrote a pamphlet called Hum Hindu Nahi Hai, We Are Not Hindus. This note, first struck by the British and then picked up by the collaborationists or the loyalists, has not lacked a place in subsequent times, writings and politics of subsequent times, leading eventually in our own time to an intransigent politics, leading to politics of intolerance. Ramswarup continues to remark, but that the Sikhs learn their history from the British is not peculiar to them. This is not a peculiar phenomenon confined only to the only to the Sikhs. We all do it, Ramswarup says. With the British, we all believe that India is merely a land where successive invaders made good, and that this country is only a miscellany of ideas and peoples. In short, a nation without a nomos or spiritual or personality or vision of its own. So we all know about the infamous Aryan invasion theory or its later version, namely the Aryan migration theory, which basically posits Indian history as a series of successive invasions by foreigners and sees the Indian society and mainly the Hindu society as a sort of salad bowl, a mixture, a confused mixture, a hodgepodge of different communities, races, as the Indologists have called, including the neo-Indologists, if we can describe them by that name. So this was not particular to the Sikhs, that they were painted as a victim of this sort of series of invasions, and therefore they are merely a part of what has been quite normalized by Indologist scholarship, especially the British Indologists. So the fact that many members of the Sikh community fell for this narrative is something of a phenomenon which is observable across the Hindu society. There are many people within the Hindu society who fall for this narrative and sort of start hating themselves and their ancestors, as well as their customs, their religion, their culture, for the present maladies of the Indian society, for all of its maladies. And they end up blaming only the Hindu religion and Hindu spirituality, Hindu sociology for all the things that are bad in India. And nowadays it has become a trend to also blame some of the global phenomena, such as racism, on Hinduism. Very peculiar. So this is not peculiar to the Sikhs who fell for the British Indologists' weaving of the narrative of successive invasions and a melting pot society that India is, and therefore it is not a land, it is not a civilization with a distinct personality, with a distinct spirituality, and a distinct worldview. Ramswarup also reports in this pamphlet, namely the Hindu-Sikh relationship, that it was a concerted effort in which the officials, the scholars, and the missionaries all joined. The officials, he of course means the colonial administrators. In order to separate the Sikhs, they were even made into a sect of Islam, like I was mentioning while discussing Hughes and his Dictionary of Islam. For example, one Thomas Patrick Hughes, who had worked as a missionary for 20 years in Peshawar, edited the Dictionary of Islam. The work itself is scholarly, but like most European scholarship, it had a colonial inspiration. The third biggest article, and this is particularly funny, the third biggest article in this work after Muhammad and the Quran is on Sikhism, Ramswarup writes. It devotes 1/4 of a page to the Sunnis, 1/4 of a page to the Sunnis, who are the largest sect within Islam, but devotes 11.5 pages, as many as 11.5 pages to the Sikhs. Probably, Ramswarup writes, the editor himself thought it rather excessive For he offers an explanation to the Orientalists who, Ramswarup quotes from the editor of this dictionary, may perhaps be surprised to find that Sikhism has been treated as a sect of Islam, unquote. Then Ramswarup continues, indeed, it is surprising to the non-Orientalists too, for it must be a strange sect of Islam where the word Muhammad does not occur even once in the writings of its founder, Guru Nanak Dev. But the inclusion of such an article in the present work seemed to be most desirable, as the editor says. And Ramswarup very correctly points out that it was a policy matter. It was a matter of British colonial administration's policy to devote such a huge space within a dictionary of Islam to Sikhism, as many as 11 and a half pages, while the Sunni sect gets only half a page, or 1/4 of a page, even less. So, as per Ramswarup analysis of this policy with regard to scholarship or through scholarship, the influence of scholarship is silent, subtle, and long range. That is true. The influence of scholarship is silent, subtle, and long range. It always targets the long term impacts on a particular society which it is studying. Through anthropological, sociological, and historical studies, the scholars aim to create, the Indology scholars in particular, aim to create seeds of division, and that has borne its fruit. Now, coming to the British Army's policy, Ramswarup tells us that Macauliffe and others provided categories which became the thought equipment of subsequent Sikh intellectuals. So, the scholarship of people like Hughes or Trump or Macauliffe, not Macaulay, by the way, not Lord Macaulay, not to be confused with the person who had introduced the infamous Minutes on Education in 1835. But this is another scholar who devoted his energies, his focus, particularly onto Sikhism. Macauliffe and others provided the categories through their scholarship, which became the thought equipment of subsequent Sikh intellectuals. But, Ramswarup continues to tell us, the British government did not neglect the quicker administrative and political measures. They developed a special army policy which gave results even in the short run. While they disarmed the nation as a whole, they created privileged enclaves of what they called martial races. And the Sikhs were one of these martial races as identified and categorized by the British. The British had conquered the Punjab with the help of the Purabiya soldiers from UP, present day UP and Bihar, and even from Bengal, some of them. Many of them were Brahmins, these Purabiya soldiers, many of them were Brahmins. But they played a rebellious role in 1857. So the British dropped them and sought other elements. Because the majority of the Purabiya soldiers had rebelled against their British masters. So the British thought that these are charlatans and these are troublemakers. Therefore, let's drop them and induct the martial sects, the martial communities, namely the Sikhs and some other communities from the hills, with the hope that the Sikhs will be loyal soldiers and loyal subjects. The Sikhs were chosen by the British. In 1855, there were only 1,500 Sikh soldiers, mostly Mazhabis, a particular caste within the community. And he continues to tell us, Ramswarup continues, and I quote, in 1910, from that particular statistic that we have shared in the previous slide, we see the drastic change. In 1910, there were 33,000 out of a total of 174,000. This time mostly Jats, just a little less than 1/5 of the total army strength. So within a matter of 50 or 60 years at most, there is a huge upsurge in the numbers of the Sikh soldiers within the British Army. So this tells a lot about the changes in British policy, in particular the policy of the army and recruitment within the army, as an impact of the 1857 rebellion or the First War of Independence. Their very recruitment was calculated to give them, the Sikhs, a sense of separateness and exclusiveness, Ramswarup tells us. Only such Sikhs were recruited who observed the marks of the Khalsa. They were sent to receive baptism according to the rites prescribed by Guru Gobind Singh. Each regiment had its own granthis, or the readers, or in a way, priests who could do the chantings and readings from the Guru Granth Sahib. The greetings exchanged between the British officers and the Sikh soldiers were Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Very strange. A secret CID memorandum, as we have already mentioned, prepared by D. Petrie, who was assistant director of the criminal intelligence in 1911. The report, which was prepared in 1911, says that every endeavor has been made to preserve them, meaning the Sikh soldiers, from the contagion of idolatry. Idolatry is the name that the colonial missionaries together had given to Hinduism. So this is a very pertinent observation made by Ramswarup in his pamphlet, that through the special favors given to the Sikh community in terms of recruitment into British Army, the British had hoped to win the favor of the Sikhs. And secondly, this was first, and secondly, they had also tried to make a distinct identity of the Sikh community as a martial race, separate from Hindus at large. Ramswarup continues to tell us, thanks to these measures, the Sikhs in the Indian Army have been studiously nationalized. That term is important. This is McAuliffe reporting. So McAuliffe observed that Sikhs in the Indian Army had been studiously nationalized because of these measures taken by the British Army. About the meaning of this nationalization, Ramswarup tells us, we are left in no doubt. Petrie, that assistant director of the criminal intelligence, explains that it means that the Sikhs were, quote unquote, encouraged to regard themselves as a totally distinct and separate nation. No wonder, Ramswarup now analyzes, that the British congratulated themselves and held that the preservation of Sikhism as a separate religion was largely due to the action of the British officers, as a British administrator put it. So they were very happy that the policies adopted by the British Army were bearing fruit, at least in the immediate result, as was seen by the recruitment of the Sikhs in large numbers into the British Army. Now, if you look at the very careful politicization of this community by the British, following Ramswarup's observations, we find that the British also worked on a more political level, apart from just recruiting more and more Sikhs into the British Army or using colonial scholarship, missionaries to influence the narrative. The British were also trying to politicize the community itself. Singh Sabhas were started, manned mostly by ex-soldiers, people who had retired from the British Army. These worked under Khalsa Diwans established at Lahore and Amritsar. Later on, in 1902, the two Diwans were amalgamated into one body of the Chief Khalsa Diwan, providing political leadership to the Sikhs. They all wore the badge of loyalty to the British. So these were chiefly the loyalists, as Ramswarup describes. As early as 1872, the loyal Sikhs supported the cruel suppression of the Namdhari Sikhs, who had started a Swadeshi movement. As early as 1872, the Namdhari Sikhs had started a very indigenous sort of movement, the Swadeshi movement, as Ramswarup calls it. And this was suppressed by the loyalist Sikhs cruelly. They were described as, the Namdharis were described as a wicked and misguided sect. The same forces described the Ghadarites, the members of the Ghadar party, in 1914 as rebels who should be dealt with mercilessly. Ramswarup also observes these organizations also spearheaded the movement for the de-Hinduization of the Sikhs and preached that the Sikhs were distinct from the Hindus. The emphasis was on the distinction of the Sikhs as a separate nation, as a separate people with a separate culture and religion. Ramswarup continues, anticipating the Muslims. They represented to the British government as far back as 1888 that they be recognized as a separate community. They expelled the Brahmins from the Harmandir, the Golden Temple, where the latter had worked as priests. They also threw out the idols of quote-unquote Hindu gods, Ramswarup tells us, from this temple which were installed there. So in this connection, Ramswarup actually does a bit of archival work for his research and retrieves a letter from the newspapers. Ramswarup tells, a student, Bir Singh, in a letter to Khalsa Akbar, dated February 12, 1897, tells us of a picture of Durga painted on the front wall of a room near the Dukhbhanjani Bedi in the Golden Temple precincts. The goddess stands on golden sandals and she has many hands, 10 or perhaps 20. One of the hands is stretched out, and in this hand she holds a khanda. Guru Govind Singh stands barefoot in front of it with his hands folded. He says, he meaning the student Bir Singh, who Ramswarup quotes from this particular edition of the Khalsa Akbar. Ramswarup adds that we do not know, pertaining to that letter, what these gods were and how quote-unquote Hindu they were. But most of them are adoringly mentioned in the poems of Guru Nanak Dev. At any rate, more often than not, iconoclasm has hardly much spiritual content. And this is where Ramswarup actually gives the crux of his analysis of how the Sikh spirituality was attempted to be dissociated from its larger Indic heritage. At any rate, Ramswarup tells, more often than not, iconoclasm has hardly much spiritual content. On the other hand, it is a misanthropic idea and is meant to show one's hatred for one's neighbor. In this particular case, it was also meant to impress the British with one's loyalty. Hitherto, the Brahmins had presided over different Sikh ceremonies which were the same as those of Hindus. And in this case, Ramswarup again digs out a particular letter in the newspapers of the late 19th century, where there is a mention, as Ramswarup describes, of the Shraddha ceremony of Guru Arjan Dev Ji towards the end, I think on the last day of the month of Bhadon. So there was now a tendency to have separate rituals, Ramswarup says. In 1909, the Ananda Marriage Act was passed by the British. So through rituals, through separate ceremonies, through separate symbols, and the highlighting of this constant separateness, the British were trying to politicize and give a distinct identity of a separate nation to the Sikhs, as per Ramswarup's analysis. Ramswarup also says that the British played their game as best as they could, but they did not possess all the cards. This is where he begins to delineate, begins to identify where the British plans failed and how they did not bear the desired fruits as the British had wanted. The British played their game as best as they could, but they did not possess all the cards. The Hindu-Sikh ties, Ramswarup tells us, were too intimate and numerous, and these continued without much strain at the grassroots level. Only a small section maintained that there was a distinct line of cleavage between Hinduism and Sikhism. But a large section, as the British found, favors, or at any rate views with indifference, the reabsorption of the Sikhs into Hinduism. This is where Ramswarup is actually quoting Petrie, the Assistant Director of the Criminal Intelligence of the British administration. They found it sad, they meaning the British colonial administrators, found it sad to think that very important classes of Sikhs like Nanakpanthis or Sahajdharis did not even think it incumbent on them to adopt the ceremonial and social observances of Guru Gobind Singh, and did not even in theory reject the authority of the Brahmins. So this is how Petrie had lamented in his secret report for the observations that he made of the Sikh politics between 1900 and 1911. Ramswarup adds, the glorification of the Sikhs was welcome to the British to the extent that it separated them from the Hindus, but it had its disadvantages too. Mr. Petrie found it a constant source of danger, something which tended to give the Sikhs a wind in the head. Sikh nationalism, Ramswarup reports, once stimulated, refused British guidance and developed its own ambitions. So now it was going gradually out of control of the British. The neo-nationalist Sikhs thought of a glorious past and had dreams of a glorious future, but neither in his past nor in his future was there a place for the British officer, as a British administrator complained. Any worthwhile Sikh nationalism was incompatible with loyalty to the British. When neo-nationalists like Love Singh spoke of the past sufferings of the Sikhs at the hands of the Mohammedans, the British found in the statement a covert reference to themselves. This is very important. When they admired, Ramswarup tells us, the Gurus for their devotion to religion and their disregard for life, the British heard in it a call to sedition. Sedition from where? Sedition from the British colonial administration and from the subjecthood of the British Empire. So it's important to note here how Ramswarup very insightfully locates the point in time from where the whole political movement of the Sikhs, and this was in the beginning of the 20th century, in the first few decades of the 20th century, where the neo-nationalist Sikhs, many of whom were young people, and some of whom were actually located outside of India, in the diaspora, in countries like US and Canada, they had started to dream of a glorious future for the Sikhs, which takes its inspiration, which takes its sustenance from the glorious past as has been described in the records of history for the Sikhs of Maharaja Ranjit Singh's empire, most particularly. And therefore, whenever they spoke, the new nationalists spoke of this future ambition, the British became more anxious than anything else. And they saw in such pronouncements a call to secede from the British Empire, which is definitely not what they had intended in the first place. So Ramswarup continues to tell us about this defense against the British policy and how it manifested. Sikh nationalism was meant to hurt the Hindus, but in fact, it hurt the British. So it backfired on the British. For what nourished Sikh nationalism also nourished Hindu nationalism. The glories of Sikh gurus are part of the glories of the Hindus, and these have been sung by poets like Tagore and others. I remember at least two long poems written by Rabindranath Tagore, One is, of course, the famous Bondi Bir, or the captive hero, where Tagore eulogizes the successful attempts at defeating the Mughal tyrants by Banda Bahadur. And the other poem that Tagore had composed, this was also a very long poem and a very sublimely composed poem, called Guru Gobind, in which he describes that period in the Guru's life, in the 10th Guru's life, when he was preparing himself for a career of the leader of the Sikh community. So in this poem, we get to see how Guru Gobind Singh is talking about a very inspired and high spirituality, about his tapasya, about his sadhana, to gain power, gain the strength in order to raise the Khalsa army. And until that is done, he continues to shun the worldly life. That is how the poem describes that particular part of Guruji's life. So Ram Sarup continues to tell us, on the other hand, as Christians and as rulers, the British could not go very far in this direction. In fact, in their more private consultations, they spoke contemptuously of the Gurus. Mr. Petrie considered Guru Arjan Dev Ji as essentially a mercenary who was prepared to fight for or against the Mughal as convenience or profit dictated. They always spoke of the Gurus in derogatory terms when it suited them, because when they are talking within themselves, when they are writing secret confidential reports, there we get to see their real sentiments and their real attitude towards the Sikhs. For all the pretensions that they had about caring for the upliftment of the Sikhs as a distinct nation in the Indian colony that they were occupying, this is what the British really thought about the Gurus and the heroes of the Sikh community. So after describing Guru Arjan Dev in derogatory terms, Petrie also continues to talk about others, such as Guru Tegh Bahadur Ji. He describes Guru Tegh Bahadur Ji as an infidel, a robber and a rebel, outrageous, who was executed at Delhi by the Mughal authorities. And Ram Sarup rightly points out that as imperialists, the British naturally sympathized with the Mughals and shared their viewpoint. Otherwise, why would somebody describe the champions of the Sikh spirituality, the venerable gurus like Guru Arjan Dev Ji and Guru Tegh Bahadur Ji, as infidels and mercenaries and robbers and so on? Outrageous words to use. In conclusion, Ram Sarup gives us his observations about how this sowing of the seeds of division by British has impacted the post-independence politics with regard to Sikhs and in particular the Hindu-Sikh relationship, the Hindu-Sikh ties, so social ties, spiritual ties. But from the previous section which we just discussed, two things become apparent. And here I am giving my own observations as opposed to the observations by Ram Sarup that we have been discussing so far. One, the British colonial administration was quite anxious to create a particularly exclusive Sikh identity. This becomes very clear from our perusal of the data, the information that Ram Sarup has collated in this pamphlet. And this exclusive Sikh identity, which the British tried to create, they hoped that it would be understood by everybody, including the members of the Sikh community, as distinct from the mainstream of Indic traditions. That is, the spiritual traditions, the cultural traditions, which are indigenous to India, traditions which have originated and flourished on the Indian soil. So that is one. And secondly, as consummate imperialists with clear and substantial colonial interests in India, the British remained highly suspicious of the Sikh community and its political directions. So much so that they could never really regard with any real respect the symbols and individuals from which the Sikh community derived its pride, as well as its social, moral, spiritual sustenance, regardless of all the machinations which the British had set in motion in the hope of fomenting a secessionist Sikh nationalism, a strategy which ultimately backfired on the British. This, I think, is especially important in the context of today's politics and today's socio-cultural dynamics with regard to Hindu-Sikh relationship. I think it is incumbent upon all of us, Sikhs, Hindus, to think about, to reflect upon these British policies through the scholars, through the colonial administrators, the British Army policy, or through the missionary activities, how the Sikh community has been painted in a certain color, and how the Hindu community has also automatically been painted in a particular light. And what are the implications of such portrayal is what we need to closely consider. If we do not do so, then the strife that the British had tried to sow amongst our communities will only grow, and that will be disastrous not only for the Indian culture and civilization, but particularly for the Sikh community as well as the Hindu community. Thank you. I will conclude here and invite questions, comments, and discussions.
So my question is exactly what was referred to in what you have also explained about how and why in the whole backdrop of the Bhakti movement, you have Guru Nanak Ji's teachings also coming in. But we who are not Sikhs have often been told and even taught in history that there is quite a bit of an Islamic influence even in the teachings of Guru Nanak. So again, I'm not an expert. I've not read the Guru Granth Sahib or anything, but this is what we've been told, that it was more like a syncretic religion. And especially in our history, this is how we've been taught. That Sikhism was more like that. Whereas here, what you present here is a little different from that. And there is this feeling even now when we see these, calls for Sikh separatism and all that, there is some kind of a leaning that they have towards some Islamic tenets. So if you have any information on this, if you could throw some light on it, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
A very pertinent question. Thank you for that. But not as an expert, rather as an enthusiast, as a reader of Sikh history, Sikh literature. I would like to point out that, and Ram Sarup has also pointed it out, including Sitaram Goel, that the particular strain, particular manifestation of Hindu spirituality, which saw its resurgence in the western part of the Indian subcontinent, particularly in Punjab. The influence of the yogic traditions and the Advaita tradition, where Nirakar Upasana, the eulogization of the Nirgun Brahma, the focus on Nirgun Brahma, took the central part, the central position. This did not, this influence of the yogic and Advaitic traditions were not confined only to the Hindu sadhakas, the Hindu yogis, or the members of the Hindu community in general. It also significantly influenced, Ram Sarup and Sitaram Goel informs us, some of the Sufi upasakas or sadhakas. So some of these Sufi individuals have been referred to in the Guru Granth Sahib, such as I think Farid. And thus, the question of syncretism, I would say, takes it a bit further in highlighting the influence of Islam and influence of Sufism, whereas in reality it is the other way around. It is the influence of Hindu yogic and Advaitic traditions upon Islam, and especially that segment of Islam which had already started to talk in a bit of a quote unquote liberal way, namely the Sufis. So it was the influence of the Advaitic and Yogic traditions in the Punjab region among the Sufis of that region that enabled the Sikh gurus to find, to identify the echoes of the same message, the same Advaitic and Yogic messages, the messages of the Hindu spirituality, and include them in the Vanis. So that would be my response to your question.
I've got two specific comments. I would like you to then comment on that. One, looking at what has been happening in Punjab for the last 4 decades, it appears that the British have succeeded in dividing the Sikhs and the Hindus. Unfortunately, it has been the sad plight of Punjab, especially during the time of Bhindranwale and company. In fact, that somebody like that could come up at all, and so much damage was done to the Punjab economy and the people and the psyche. That indicates that the seeds sown by the British are bearing fruit even today. The Khalistanis who are outside Punjab, in Canada or wherever they are the fruits of the British, build up of Sikhism being separate. I would like you to comment on that. That's one point. Second, British have done the same thing. You had talked about the Nirankari and non-idol worship way of doing things. Okay. Advaita. They had done the same thing in Bengal also, where the Brahmo Samaja and other people had come up. And the same thing had been purportedly done in South India also. So this is not something unique to the Sikhs alone, where they tried to demolish the local religious, composition. They have tried it all over the country. This is the second point. That's all, sir.
Thank you so much, Colonel, for your comments. Regarding the first point that you have raised, and I would only agree with you. And to further the discussion on this, I would like to draw your attention to some of the things that Ramswarup says, and which I could not include in my presentation for lack of time. And if I may read out some segments towards the end of this pamphlet by Ramswarup. Ramswarup says, independence came accompanied by division of the country and large displacement of population. The country faced big problems, but she managed to keep above water. We were also able to retain democracy, but just when we thought we had come out of the woods, divisive forces which lay low for a time reappeared. The old drama with a new caste began to be enacted again. Muslim separatist politics, held by huge Arab funds, has become active again. So Ramswarup is here talking about his contemporary times, namely the late 1980s. Christian missions have their own ambitions. They both are looking at the politics of extremist Sikhs with great hope and interest, and they find it fits well with their own plans. So this is a very important observation by Ramswarup, I would say, that he successfully links the separatist faction within the Sikh community with the attempts, with the troublemaking attempts by Christian missionaries as well as the funders from outside of India and sometimes even within India, who are within the large, by and large, Islamist movement. So that establishment of the link between these different centers of trouble, sources of trouble, is important. Ramswarup also says when the British showed solicitude for the minorities, so the minority politics becomes a very pertinent thing here. And we need to honestly reflect on the echo of minority politics as practiced by the British in the successive Indian administration post independence, and see the implications of that politics, the minority politics, with regard to Hindu Sikh relationship. Ramswarup says, and I quote, when the British showed solicitude for the minorities, nationalistic forces in India resented it and called it a British game. But surprisingly enough, the game continues to be played even after the British left. The minorities are encouraged to feel insecure and aggrieved. The minority stick is found handy to beat the majority, namely the Hindus. Hindu baiting is politically profitable and intellectually fashionable. What Ramswarup was talking about in 1985, 1986 still holds true today. Constantly under attack, a Hindu tries to save himself by self-accusation. He behaves as if he is making amends for being a Hindu. Now, this part is very, very important. In the last 2 decades, so he's talking about 1960s, 70s, running up to 1980s, another separating factor too has been silently at work. And in my opinion, this holds true even today. Thanks to the Green Revolution and various other factors, a section of the Sikhs have become relatively more rich and prosperous. No wonder they have begun to find that the Hindu bond is not good enough for them, and they seek a new identity readily available to them thanks to the scholarship of McAuliffe, Hughes, and so on and so forth, in their names and outer symbols. This is an understandable human frailty, Ramswarup observes. You have been our defenders, Hindus tell the Sikhs, as Ramswarup tries to explain this, psychologically, I would say. You have been our defenders, Hindus tell the Sikhs. But in the present psychology, the compliment wins only contempt, and I believe rightly. Here, Ramswarup is saying that I believe that this contempt, by constantly repeating the sentiment that you have been our defenders, only draws contempt, and this contempt is rightly placed, Ramswarup says. For self-despisement is the surest way of losing a friend or even a brother. It also gives the Sikhs an exaggerated self-assessment. Under the pressure of this psychology, then Ramswarup continues, grievances were manufactured, extreme slogans were put forward with which even moderate elements had to keep pace. Now, this is again a very psychologically valid phenomenon that within any community, within any society, those who are the most extreme, those who take the most extreme positions, are more clearly heard because of the high ranging decibel sound that they make. And therefore, those who are moderates, those who are not in agreement with much of the extremist position, are also forced because of social ties, because of many other pressures, to keep pace with them, to support them. Camps came up in India as well as across the border, where young men were taught killing, sabotage, and guerrilla warfare. Finding no check, it knew not where to stop, Ramswarup says. It became a law unto itself. It began to dictate, to bully. The temple at Amritsar, at a certain point in time, he is referring to the events in 1984, an arsenal, a fort, a sanctuary for this extremist section. And this grave situation called for necessary action, which caused some unavoidable damage to the building, Ramswarup tells us. When this happened, the same people who looked at the previous drama, either helplessly or with an indulgent eye, felt outraged. There were protest meetings, resolutions, desertions from the army, aid committees for the suspects apprehended, and even calls and vows to take revenge. The extremists were forgotten totally. There were two standards at work, as Ramswarup points out. there was a complete lack of self-reflection on the part of the moderate sections and the Sikh community in general, and responsible Sikh leaders. So he points fingers at not just the Sikh leadership, political leadership, as well as spiritual leadership, but also to the moderate sections, the general populace within the Sikhs. The whole thing created widespread resentment all over India, which burst into a most unwholesome violence when Mrs. Indira Gandhi was assassinated, Ramswarup reports. The befoggers have again got busy, and then they explain the whole tragedy in terms of collusion between the politicians and the police. But this conspiracy theory cannot explain the range and the virulence of the tragedy. So he is calling for an attitude of looking at things as they are, looking at things in a very unbiased manner, an honest manner, without which there is no hope from the problem, the malady that Ramswarup points out, and which you in your comment have also pointed out. That's what I would say. And the second question that you have brought up with regard to the manifestation of Nirguna Upasana, Nirakara Upasana with regard to Brahmo Samaj and other such factions, I have my reservations in seeing these two manifestations as part of the same phenomenon. Why? I will again maybe refresh your memory of this first part of the talk, where I was talking about the historical context within which the Sikh spirituality found its peculiar articulation. Because the northwestern part of the Indian subcontinent had been almost completely denuded of temples, and there was no circumstance in which it was possible to hold ritual worship, to use symbols of the Hindu spirituality, that it was that it gave as the only option the Nirakara Upasana to evolve there, and that manifested as Sikh spirituality. But in the case of Bengal, that the case was not so severe. There were many temples, and even though the temples were raised to the ground, they were again built up continuously. And the Brahmo Samaj movement was rather the manifestation of a newfound confidence of the Hindu community, I would say, in asserting itself at par with the Western civilization. So here the anxiety was that we are by no means less than our Western counterparts. It is unfair for the Western ideologists to paint Hinduism as out and out idolatrous, as a practice of idolatry and hedonism. And we have more subtle, more sublime aspects to our religiosity, to our spiritualism. And that was brought forth by Raja Ram Mohan Rai and the subsequent leadership of the Brahmo Samaj, like Devendranath Thakur or Rabindranath Tagore and others. So I would suggest that these two phenomena are distinct. The Sikh spirituality as it manifested in Punjab, and the Brahmo Samaj, and even the Arya Samaj phenomenon.
A lot of aspects are new to me. Few I had already heard during one of the conversation. My question probably would be a mix of what Rama sir said and probably something that you have already covered. So few part could be a bit repetitive. We speak about Nirgun Upasana in Sikh Samaj, right? And it is not that it is alien to Sanatan. It is already there. But we can understand that for a general public to expect them to do bhakti or upasana of a Nirgun Brahm is not possible all the time. And that is the reason why we have deities everywhere, right? Do you think that because, and if I look at Sikh, and if I look at, if I listen to people who are neutral on the term and not very rigid about no Murti Puja, I could hear that there is an acceptance for both. So none of the Sanatan Paramparas completely reject any philosophy. Advaita also doesn't say that, Sagun Upasana is not possible. It is just that we are not doing that. So when you look at the current society, and taking a leaf from Colonel Rama's point, not talking about separatists, I'm talking about the general society. When you completely reject a way which is more acceptable to the general public, do you think that leads to a place where the society does not know where to look? And related to this is, if you go to Punjab, you see there is Dera culture there. And what is Dera culture? Dera culture is where you need a live guru who can guide you, which probably is not there in the Sikh Dharma. So when you look at these things, and taking the point that yes, probably the British could not do it or could not persuade the society, Sikh society in the way they wanted then, it is happening now. And is it happening because it has become very rigid in its own belief, where they are rejecting a portion which can be kind of accepted?
Yes, absolutely. So, firstly, I would concur with you in saying that none of the Indic traditions are rigid as the monotheistic traditions are. And in fact, in this particular pamphlet itself, in the introduction, Sitaram Goel points it out, and Ram Sarup reinforces it by saying that monotheism is the mother of all evil. I quote him basically. Monotheism is the mother of all evil. It always divides humanity into two warring factions, and then people are at each other's throat. So we never saw any kind of violence, violent clash between the different Indic traditions. There may be political reasons for clashes. Maybe one particular king, one particular emperor had patronized egoistic impulses out of his own ambitions. He had made some silly actions, and he had committed some silly actions such as banishing some people outside of their territory, or taking out a particular vigraha and replacing it with another. So never for darshanika reasons, for from the point of view of spirituality, there was any conflict ever in India. Monotheism, when it is introduced, and as I have tried to explain, how the scholars, the colonial scholars especially, and then also the loyalist scholars, have tried to only emphasize such kind of interpretation which portray the Sikh spirituality as a sort of Abrahamized monotheistic religion, with a book. Sometimes this is put forth by such scholars as saying that the difference between Sikhs and Hindus and their religions are quite clear, because there is a clear single book for the Sikhs, namely the Guru Granth Sahib, and there is no single book that Hindus can claim as the one book upon which their religion is based. So that is one point. Apart from that, I'd also like to point out that Ram Sarup actually talks about this, that the different sections within the Sikh spiritual practice, such as Sahajadharis, Namdhari Sikhs, and so on and so forth, they have been progressively marginalized by the extremists, and somehow a very perverted form of the Khalsa became dominant. And Ram Sarup also points out that apart from a particular historical point in time, apart from a particular historical exigency, there was little relevance for the Khalsa. When the Sikh empire was established, the majority of the Sikh army of Maharaja Ranjit Singh were constituted by the Khalsa Sikhs. And there were also, soldiers of different nationalities, including some European soldiers as well. But the Khalsa Sikhs constituted the majority in Maharaja Ranjit Singh's army. But once that empire was demolished dissolved by the British, there was no historical exigency left. There was no relevance remaining for the Khalsa to continue. And very funnily, the British officials, people like Petrie and so on, they are lamenting the fact that because Khalsa has lost its relevance after the dissolution of Maharaja Ranjit Singh's empire, many of the former members of the Khalsa are going back into the Hindu fold. They're losing their outer forms of the symbols that separate them from Hindus, and they are also taking recourse to some of the rites of passages and some of the customs that the Brahmins led them in doing. For example, I mentioned a particular letter that Ramswarup had found out from the newspaper archives, where the Shraddha ceremony of Guru Arjan Dev Ji was performed by Brahmins. And similarly, Namkaran and other samskaras, Vivaha samskaras mainly, up until the time when the Ananda Marriage Act was passed, I think in the first decade itself of the 20th century, 1910 or 1911 maybe. All these rites of passage were as per the Sanatana Vedic rituals. So therefore, there was a very conscious attempt on part of both the British scholars as well as the loyalist scholars, as Ramswarup describes them, to highlight the points of difference, so-called difference, which were not actually difference. You could locate them very well within the Advaitic and Yogic traditions. And also the connection, the far-fetched connection with the Abrahamic faiths, and most importantly with Islam, by saying that this is also a religion of one book and monotheistic, one God, and so on and so forth. So this is an unfortunate turn of events that in the present circumstances, that dominant section, it still continues to scream at the top of its voice, and that section's voice is represented or misrepresented as the authentic voice of the Sikh community.
So if you just take 2 steps back, there was a recent discussion that happened on the, I hope I'm pronouncing it right, Petrie report, which was commissioned after 1857 revolt, and I'm probably not able to put it in the right sequence, but there were a couple of conclusions that were made. One conclusion was that Jati system is one of the strongest system that binds India together. It is very difficult to divide the people, because even if people go from, let's say, from Hindu fold to Muslim fold, they still carry their Jati there. And the other was, and they did not say caste, they said Jati as prominently. The two was the 1857 revolt happened at every level, from people at administrator to soldiers to local, and they said that the perpetuator of this was actually the Brahmins. This was categorically mentioned there. And the third conclusion was, the third point was that we have to identify someone who doesn't associate with their Jati or is trying to leave that pattern. And for that, you see that Sikh community as a, I won't say vulnerable, but yes, probably one section which proclaims that they don't belong to any Jati system. So the report, not as a conclusion, but says that now what you have to do is that you have to promote a category that does not associate with the Jati system and bring them forward. So which means hire them more, get them prominent positions, keep them distinct, don't let them be part of the Jati system. And 3, find out the fault lines in the society and blame Brahmins for that. And this is a fantastic report which actually says that how the British understood the problem, understood the fault lines, identified a solution, and somehow came up with this whole problem that Brahmins are responsible for everything, and also elevate Sikhs as something which is better than a Hindu version. So could you speak a little bit about it, since you did talk about Petrie report a little bit? So Did this all happen after this report was published? And if you could elaborate a little on that.
Yeah, the circumstances that led to the publication of the Petri report were already in place, and Petri report actually came out in the second or third decade of the 20th century. But there were previous reports, such as the Punjab Administration Report of 1855 to 1860, the circumstances in Punjab in that time period, which was summarized in that report, which basically told the same things that you just described about the Jati system and what could be the points of difference between the Hindu society and the Sikh community in particular. But what binds them together, the Petri report and the previous Punjab administration reports, is the fact that both are lamenting in a very clear manner that as soon as there is no historical exigency for the Khalsa to continue to draw its sustenance from the Sikh and the Hindu community, non-Khalsa Sikh and the Hindu community at large, they are dissolving back into their Hindu fold. And in this case, I think Petri specifically mentions a parallel between the phenomenon of how Buddhism, which was a very prominent religion in India at one point in time, but it was absorbed back within Hinduism. That same kind of phenomenon is repeating with respect to the Sikhs, the Sikh religion and the Sikh community. Funnily, Petri describes Hinduism in this connection as the boa constrictor, as the ajagar of the Indian jungles, which actually, gobbles up all the sects, all the communities, all the religions that were originated from the Indic traditions on the Indian soil. So yes, I think a thorough perusal of the Punjab administration reports as well as the Petri report would reveal a lot of things which should be brought in focus and which should be discussed freely by both Sikh scholars as well as the general public among Sikhs and Hindus.
Srijitji, the British have been so systematically following the divide and rule policy. Not only in India, I'm sure they would be doing it in their other colonies also. So over the centuries, have they been openly called out about this in academia or criticized about this? And if so, where?
Yes, the one part of this critique has come out of Africa, and most particularly from the Anglophone parts of Africa, meaning the parts in the African continent which were under the British rule, British colonial rule, because there were other European nations also which had, subjugated several African nations. So from Nigeria and from Kenya, two countries which were subjugated by the British, colonized, we see very powerful voices in the forms, not only in the academic forms, but also in artistic forms, through literature, through drama. We have found how a very good documentation of this divide and rule policy is depicted, and the psychological cognitive dissonances that were sown by the British because of the missionary activities to begin with, and then colonial officers' activities. These were wonderfully shown by the African scholars and African literateurs, authors. I would like to mention a particular novel, Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, the great Nigerian novelist, where he describes through this novel how a very well-structured, close-knit community of indigenous people in Africa, in Nigeria in particular, can be devastated, and that impact of the devastation lasts and continues to work through generations, not just for one generation or two generations, but for successive generations. In fact, this particular novel, Things Fall Apart, was followed up by Achebe with two more novels, Arrow of God and the other one I cannot recall right now. These three actually depict the devastation across generations of the divide and rule policy, And we get to see the same, devastation still at work, with the Nigerian society being torn apart by all these conflicts between Christians and Muslims, the Boko Haram and so on and so forth, who are killing Christians, and then the Christians are trying to proselytize more and more people, and some people have a very strong decolonizing strain within them, especially in Kenya, which are trying to come out of the influence of Christian missionaries. And then there is some political machination going on there with regard to declaring them as rebels, as outlaws, and so on and so forth. So the case of Kenya, Nigeria, and other African nations, and the documentation by academics as well as literary activists, dramatists, and so on and so forth, are very good cases in this regard.
The other novel that you mentioned could have been The Heart of Darkness, which is about the Spanish rule over there.
No. Heart of Darkness is actually, written from a more colonial perspective, because it is Joseph Conrad who writes it.
Yeah.
And there he actually orientalizes Africa, if I can use the term. He basically describes Africa as the heart of all darkness that can exist in the world. And all light is centered upon Europe, and especially in England. So the other novel is actually also by Chinua Achebe. It's actually a trilogy: Arrow of God, Things Fall Apart, and No Longer at Ease. Yes, that is the name. No Longer at Ease. This trilogy is very, very telling. And also, I would like you to look at the works of the Kenyan academician, author Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who talks about decolonization at length in his book Decolonizing the Mind. These works and many other works by Lusophone, Portuguese-speaking Africans, Francophones, or the French-speaking Africans, they have really they have done a very good job of documenting the trauma and the devastation of the divide and rule policy.
Yes, could you please bring out the classic differences in belief systems and traditions between the various sects of Sikhs, such as Namdharis, Sahajdharis, Nirankaris, Radha Swamis, Nanak Panthis, Damdami Taksal, Das Panthis, and others, please?
Nandakumar ji, I have to draw a blank here. I am not an expert in the Sikh different sects within the Sikh traditions. But I would, make a small comment here because of my perusal of Sitaram Goel and Ram Swarup's descriptions of Sikh spirituality and Indic traditions in general, that the Khalsa Sikhs and the other sects that you have mentioned, they are differentiated by some of the samskaras that are still practiced by the other sects, as opposed to the Khalsa Sikhs. And there is no anxiety, so to speak, among these other non-Khalsa Sikh sampradayas with regard to the taking of names of God in the Indic terms, and especially with Hindu imageries, Hindu symbols from the Itihasa Purana lores. And there is as such no emphasis on differences. Rather, there is always an attitude of being at ease with the larger Indic traditions, and that is what is very, very apparent, very clear, very visible from outside. But if you ask me to go into the nuances and the particulars, I'm afraid I'll have to draw a blank. So maybe some Sikh expert. And if you, in this regard, I would like to mention the name of a very senior and renowned Sikh scholar, Professor Jagbeer Singh Ji, who brings out these differences as well as the continuity between the larger Indic traditions, the Vedic tradition, and the Sikh spirituality in a very beautiful manner. he has many talks, and maybe Aparna ji can consider bringing him to this platform someday.
See, we are Sindhis and we follow Guru Nanak Dev very, very extensively. I would like to say that all these religions, what you call religions, Sikhism, Jainism, Buddhism, they have originated from Sanatan Dharam. Whatever anybody, British may have done, whatever it is, and that fact has to be recognized. So we are not different from them and they are not different from us. Whatever they follow, like we have our weddings even in Gurdwaras, we follow the, death ceremony also, we'll have a Guru that, full Granth Sahib is read after that for whatever days one keeps. In fact, it was done for my mother also. So I feel, yes, but it's very unfortunate that some of these Sikhs, and yes, I must tell you one more thing in Sindhis. You see, the firstborn is very often given that time also to the Sikhs for, I think it was against the Muslims because if they were converting everybody. So I have second cousins who are like Akalis, we call them Akalis. They follow all the 5Ks. So I feel this people have really been misguided to work against the Hindus and, they want their own kingdom and their own, till today it is happening, unfortunately. So I think they need to relook at their history and their origins. That is very important. That's what I feel. Thank you.
Absolutely. Couldn't have agreed more.
I would like to add to it that it is so ironic with this, I think the liberalism past 70 years, you will see more and more Sikhs adopting Muslim names. Sahil, Rahmat, is tarah ke naam Sikhs rakhte hain. And all their gurus and the Sahibzadas died fighting the Muslims. But we have Sikhs today sitting at the border, accepting the hospitality of masjid, just to protest against the present government. They have completely forgotten their roots, completely dissociated from them. And I also belong to such a family where the eldest son used to become a Sardar.
I think it is not exclusive to any one particular community, be it Sindhis or others. I think the whole northwest part of the Indian subcontinent had at one point in time this practice of lending the eldest child to the Khalsa Panth.
As far as I think we Hindus are concerned, of course, Hindus is a very misnomer, Sanatan Dharam. We have never attacked the Sikhs or their Gurdwaras except for that Congress-led, when Indira Gandhi died. That was the only time. Otherwise, you see, we have never, ever attacked any community or anything like that. So it is very unfortunate that, they are just wanting to form their own kingdom and their own state. Till today, they have that dream.
Yes, but at the same time, I think this should also be mentioned that there still are a significant number of people within the Sikh community who are not secessionists politically and spiritually. There is no question of secessionism of any kind that occurs, and therefore, it is also perhaps necessary for academicians to focus on these marginalized Sikh sampradayas within the larger Sikh community. The non-Khalsa Sikhs. As somebody mentioned, the practice of getting initiation at the hand of a guru, like in the Dera sampradaya or the other sampradayas, where the Guru Shishya lineage and other rites of passages are followed in a certain manner still today, and who are not anxious to find out fault lines and highlight them at the cost of everything else. So a renewed focus should be there on studying these marginalized sections within the Sikh community.